Hello, this is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with another in our series of musical sequels. What happened when people are influenced by other works and wrote their own? Were they free of influences in a good way, or are they mere copyists and plagiarists? Well, I'm going to leave it to you to decide. The work in question is the Franck Symphony in D minor of 1888. Now, I have to confess, I took this up as a challenge because in the comments section of one of my other sequel videos, one of you very kindly remarked, "I'd love to see what you do with the Franck D minor." So here we are. I actually have restricted this because I think the suggestion in that comment, and it was absolutely correct, was that every French symphony after the Franck D minor is a sequel to the Franck D minor. And up to a point, I think that's probably true. But I'm talking about serious sequels to the Franck D minor. In other words, they got to have 3 movements, fast, slow, fast, cyclical form, with something from the first movement popping up again in the finale. And I don't even think they need to be French necessarily, but influenced by that Franckian ethos. In other words, a symphony with a kind of seriousness of intent, a loftiness of purpose that you hear in all of Franck's music, even a spirituality in a sense, you know? That's the essence of César Franck. And in that case, I think we can narrow it down. Anyway, I've chosen 3 different works. 3 different works, some familiar, some not, as for me, the best of the sequels to the Franck D minor. Not all of them, not any piece of junk, but these are seriously good pieces that really deserve to be heard. The first is an obvious choice, of course, you know it. It's the Chausson Symphony in B flat. Everybody likes it. Nobody listens to it. Nobody plays it. Maybe because it sounds too much like the Franck D minor. You know, the truth is, it doesn't really. Chausson's orchestration is somewhat richer. It's more Wagnerian than Franck really was. And his harmony is a little less slithery. You know, Franck has this sort of chromatic side slipping, you know, where he goes, for example, in the finale of the symphony, da 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 dum, ba da 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 dum, da 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 da. I can't do it. You know what I mean. You never know what key it's kind of slide into. Chausson doesn't really do that. His harmony is certainly rich. It's certainly chromatic. But it doesn't really sound like Franck. It sounds like Chausson. Nevertheless, we have 3 movements. We have a slow introduction to the first movement. It does all the things that the Franck D minor does. And actually, I think it takes a little less time. This is my recommended recording. It's Charles Munch with the Boston Symphony. It's a no-brainer, fellas, really. It's very, very easy. And so if you want to get the obvious sequel to the Franck from about the same time period, you have to hear the Chausson. Absolutely. Boy, that's a piece. It's funny, isn't it? It just hovers on the fringe of the repertoire, largely, I think, because it sounds like the Franck. Chausson, by the way, was the greatest composer ever to be killed in a bicycle accident. I mean, what that has to do with anything, I don't know, but you should know. Next, this is, I think, the greatest French sequel to the Franck D minor, and that's Albert Roussel's Second Symphony. The Roussel Second is a masterpiece, a huge masterpiece, completely unknown. Why? Because it ends quietly, because it's very serious. It's a very serious and dark piece. But what attracted me to it actually wasn't the seriousness and the darkness. It was the pastoral second movement, which is absolutely exquisite. I have a sample for you. I'd like you to hear it. Isn't that just marvelous? I mean, how could you not want a symphony that has that in it somewhere? Of course, what I'm not telling you is that it never comes back exactly the same way twice. It's a very heavily developmental piece of music. But there are 3 absolutely first-class recordings of this symphony. And I mean, there are more. There are a couple others as well. But I mean, 3 that are first-rate. And most of them are quite new. The first is Christoph Eschenbach with the Orchestre de Paris, coupled with a dynamite complete Bacchus and Ariane. This is a terrific disc. It's on the Ondine label. He did all of the Roussel symphonies, and actually, they're very good, except for the third, the one everyone cares about most. That one's a dud. But his second was absolutely first rate, and it's definitely worth hearing. The other one is this one with Stéphane Deneuve on Naxos with the Royal Scottish National Orchestra. This is the recording from which the example that I played you was taken of the second movement. It is absolutely first class in every way. Fresh, lively, but with the appropriate seriousness of intent and certainly the necessary intensity and enthusiasm for the work. It's magnificent. This one's coupled with the tone poem Pour une fête de printemps and the wonderful neo-Baroque suite in F, which we're going to talk about all by itself at some point. I have a little surprise in store for you there. The great recording of the second, though, and it remains the great one, is the classic Jean Martinon. This was one of the great things Martinon ever did. It was the outstanding version from the day it was issued. It still is. It's not as well recorded as the Ondine or the Naxos, but it's absolutely, totally, fabulously first rate. It's also in the Martinon icon box. And so if you want to really get the ultimate Franck symphony sequel that's maybe even better than the original, who knows, get the Roussel Second Symphony. And we did some talking about Roussel, and we talked about the Deneuve box of Roussel symphonies and other orchestral pieces on Naxos, which is fabulous. And I assume most of you just dashed out and bought the whole thing, which you should have if you didn't. But if you just want the Second Symphony, you've got to hear it. It's such an outstanding work. It really is. And it's not a crowd pleaser. That's why it doesn't get as much attention as it deserves. However, if you want a sequel, and I mean a sequel, I mean Franck Part 2, the Franck D minor, only more of the Franck D minor. This one is a hoot, guys. It really is. You got to hear this. You just got to hear this. This is Portuguese composer Luís de Freitas Branco. Now, we've talked about him in connection with his tone poem, Vatek. In the early decades of the 20th century, he wrote some fairly radical symphonic poems that had, the influence. They showed the influence of Richard Strauss and Debussy and the most modern trends. But in the 1920s, he started to turn towards symphonies. And naturally, when composers turn towards symphonies, their bowels clench. You know what I mean? They get nervous. Sometimes they get inhibited. They're looking for models. They have the, Brahms, you don't know what it's like to hear the footsteps of a giant walking behind you. They get nervous. They have all kinds of psychological issues. And the result is that their style tends to become more conservative. They take it very, very seriously. And they also take a kind of, skeptical view of orchestral color for its own sake. Someday I'll do a little talk about this because it's a very, very interesting topic, how to use orchestral timbre as a symphonic concept. The great classical composers did it. Mahler did it probably better than anybody. But a lot of composers felt that, color was a bad thing in a symphony because it distracted you from the process, from the developmental process, from the seriousness of the work by making you focus on just prettiness or other things or extra musical references. All of those things were issues. So Freitas Branco, to get back to our topic, he became somewhat more conservative, but more conservative not in a German way, in a French way. And that meant César Franck. And so his first symphony is the Franck Symphony on steroids. It is the Franck Symphony. It has the slow introduction to the first movement. It has 3 movements. It has the cyclical form. It does all the things the Franck Symphony does. And it sounds like the Franck Symphony while it's doing it. I'm going to play you a comparison of the Franck Symphony finale with the finale of Freitas Branco. And it will blow your mind. I absolutely guarantee it. So here's the opening, the finale of the Franck. Now, I want you to listen to a minute of the opening of the finale of the Freitas Branco. Unbelievable, huh? I mean, it's really startling. This is a composer. He's a very good composer. He's a very talented composer. And he was really able to capture not just Franck's, formal predilections in the general sense, but actually the harmonic style, the melodic style. I mean, everything that makes Franck, you hear in this symphony. So if you like Franck's Symphony in D minor, and you want more of the Franck Symphony in D minor, then get the Freitas Branco's Symphony No. 1 on Naxos. You've got to hear this. It's absolutely wonderful. And by the way, the disc comes with 2 other lovely works, the Scherzo Fantastique and the nationalist, folkish Suite à l'Antahana No. 1, which is gorgeous, absolutely gorgeous. These are wonderful pieces. So I hope you've enjoyed this collection of sequels to the Franck Symphony in D minor. Seriously, 3 pieces of music you really ought to own and that you'll enjoy for sure, just as much as you enjoy the original. Thank you, and keep on listening, folks.